I agreed with what John Doyle said in this clip, and I'm not going to read what he had posted here. But in this clip, I agreed wholeheartedly, and he says it in the first 30 seconds. I'm not going to play that much of it. But essentially, this is his argument here is kind of the short term versus long term when it comes to abortion. So I'll just go ahead and let it play. I want to make sure the volume's okay first. I'll turn it up if I need to.
So I was saying that nationalism is going to breed the conditions necessary for social conservatism, for more Christian policies, rather than the opposite. So it's to say that if we wanted to have a candidate running for political office who is just the most Christian, well, we would have had President Mike Huckabee by now, but we haven't, because people in America have become so calloused and they've become so polluted by sin that when they hear messaging like that wants to compel them legally to be more virtuous, it almost repulses them and they won't vote for it. I wish that weren't the case, but it is. But if you have someone like Donald Trump who can get in there and say, well, I want to close the border, I want to bring back jobs, I want to do this, and he makes, things like abortion an accessory to his campaign. It's like, oh, and I'm going to appoint pro-life justices, but he really didn't speak about that much. Well, he gets in office and now all of a sudden he appoints justices, and that leads to the conditions that overturned Roe v. Wade. 50 years of pro-life activism, the crown jewel was we have to overturn Roe v. Wade. And the guy that ultimately facilitated that, not to discredit the work that the pro-life organizations have done, but it was the guy who, frankly, they were attacking in 2015 because they were like, well, he used to be pro-choice. He's probably paid for abortions, but it's like, that's true, but we need to get a guy in there who can move the ball down the field.
And that's the point in which I agree with, right? Which is we have to get a guy in there to move the ball down the field. Now, he's opening up this argument because, which he got ahead of it pretty well, but I saw it from a lot of the other smaller conservative pundits, hosts, commentators, because I follow a lot of people on the right wing. I try to make sure, I'm keeping in track with this. And this is coming because you have a lot of people who were either, previously on the Ron DeSantis camp, or they were like never Trumpers, or you have a very, I guess, puritanical sect of the Christian right, which includes people like, Bryson, CCG Bryson, who think like it's just a travesty that they're calling him not pro-life. Essentially, they're claiming that Trump isn't pro-life, and that it's sad that there's no true pro-life candidates in the election. And while I can partially agree with that, and I see where they're coming from, I agree largely, though, with this argument, which is the long term versus the short term, and understanding just by the fact of like when you're changing culture, you can't change it rapidly, like overnight. It is an incremental thing. And that's the framing we have to change things in this country, especially through policy and through means such as this, which is like, if we want to work towards getting a national ban on abortion, your better step is to put this guy in than voting for the Mike Huckabee candidate who's not going to win the presidency. And so I agree with that argument, because if you vote for principle on just pure pro-life and you don't vote for Trump, that's essentially a vote for Biden in a two-headed race. And I'd imagine you'd probably agree with that.
I think the important thing to remember is that he's got to win the campaign, right? If he comes out super hard and says, look, I'm going to federally ban abortion, instead of just, his current platform, which is revoke Roe v. Wade and we'll throw it back to the states. If he came out and said, look, I'm going to support a federal abortion ban, that is absolutely going to rally the leftist base. We know that they just love killing babies. So I don't think it's that. I mean, it's a political strategy, right? Like he has to appeal, right, to people. He has to get voters. Like he doesn't want to rally the base of Joe Biden, who are pretty demoralized at this point. Most of them, know that they've been bent over a barrel, but the abortion issue is still huge for them. It gets them to get out and vote, and I've heard people that are like, well, I've voted Democrat down the line because, abortion rights were on the ticket. I know those people in real life. So, I mean, to say he's not pro-life because he's trying to win an election, I think is a little bit silly, especially since he's done more for the pro-life movement than any president that we've had, at least in my lifetime.
Right.
As far as I've seen, they've all pushed for easier, more plentiful abortions, to the point where more black children are killed in New York by abortion than are born. And it's not surprising that the Democrat Party really loves that, because we've talked about how they have been, and continue to be, and probably always will be, the party of actual racism.
Indeed.
But I mean, I think it's very common for a president to maybe appeal more center while they're actually winning or running for election than, once they get in office. Yeah, I think both sides do this. Biden did that. He pretended he was some kind of center candidate until he got into office and could do what he actually wanted to do.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's obviously like the what do you call that? That's like you're giving it kind of like the best interpretation. If you want to even take it like to the worst interpretation, it's essentially them viewing a hard stance on abortion as a losing issue to them. It's not something they're willing to buckle up on. But even with that, even if you leave that out, which I mean, again, it's not like it's an issue that should be sidely cast aside, at least not in my point of view. It's still, the sentiment is there, like voting for Joe Biden or voting for, insert random candidate here is still a vote against the furthering of the rights, the conservative movement back into America. So like, I agree with it, even no matter what the reasoning may be, just because by proxy of the fact of claiming back culture can only be done incrementally. It's like, this is the way. Like, I find it hard to not view it that way, because again, what candidate is going to come out of the woodworks right now at this point in time that is going to be entirely pro-life and win an election? Especially if the Trump campaign's already viewing it as a losing issue. It's like, man, dude, I don't think anyone can really kind of take that in. And it reflects what John Doyle said, which is like, we are very far from being a Christian nation, which is like, should be a reminder to people when they're trying to push these policies and understand how it's going to affect and be perceived by the mainstream, the moderates, the independents, so on and so forth.
I mean, you gotta win over the moderates and independents, though. Otherwise, you can't win.
Right.
It's just facts. I don't think there is a candidate that could come forward and come out and say, look, I'm going to ban abortion or no-fault divorce. Like, some of the things that, some people to my right, like
yeah, me,
people that are further down the right-wing rabbit hole, a lot of those policies are not policies that'll win you an election. In fact, most of them are policies that would straight up lose you an election, and it's because of the moderates and independents. I'm one of the few independents that actually is very much, or maybe not few independents, but I'm one of the few kind of libertarian types that very much is against abortion, because I don't know why I wouldn't be, right? Like, my whole principle is my rights end where another person's begins, and that baby is another person. So I think I'm a little more probably right on that issue than a lot of other libertarian types, but it's still, it's a tough thing to run on, that you're going to ban that. And it shouldn't be. Like, we should all agree, right? We shouldn't kill babies. Like, it makes sense. But, here we are.
I know. Well, it speaks more so to, like, I mean, two things there. I mean, it speaks more to just how, like, we live in a genocracy than we do a patriarchy, right? Because I think if the more men, the more masculine, I guess, vote would lean in favor of removing abortion, I would imagine. But I think that there's just such a heavy feminist influence in this country that's existed for a while, where it's just like, you can't, it's a losing issue. Exactly as you said it. Like, I might agree with like repealing the 19th. I might agree with no fault divorce. I might agree with the federal ban on national abortion. But I understand though that, these are like losing issues, because like, you're not going to have enough people willing to vote for that. So it's a matter of incrementally like showing these things to be what you want to move towards to get the people to vote for them. So there's like just so much work that has to be done before you get to that. And when you talk about the libertarian stance, I think that issue, that positioning is because, you view the libertarian, your view of the libertarian model is that, your rights end where another person's begins, but that has to operate with the premise that you view life begins at conception. And I think that's where libertarians don't all agree. I mean, that's where most people don't all agree, or a lot of people don't agree, is where does life truly begin? And so I think you have a lot of libertarians who are on your camp where they view it as basic as conservatives do, which is life begins at conception, the same way it's viewed for literally any other animal, mammal on this planet. And then you have some libertarians who've adopted well, it's just a clump in cells until this week. So like, I mean, can you really call it a person at this point? And they do a bunch of like rationalization to kind of take away its humanity.
Bill Burr does a good bit about this, right? And he basically is talking about like he's done all this work, bought ingredients, he's baking a cake, it's in the oven, he's got a timer set. Somebody comes over and takes it out of the oven, throws it everywhere. He says, "What the fuck did you do to my cake?" And the person's like, "Oh, that's not a cake." And he's like, "Well, if you had left it in there, it would have been a cake soon." That's how I feel about the whole thing. He's probably the most genuine person I've heard that say, "Look, I'm anti-abortion, but I also understand that it's killing a baby," which I think is funny because most of them they're anti-abortion, but they're not admitting that what you're doing is killing a baby. And also, I think a lot of them probably don't know that you're killing a baby, and the people that are taking the baby corpse are profiting off the baby corpse. So,
yeah. I mean, dude, the profit model on it's so gross.
We're killing children, and then they're using their parts to make money. It's disgusting.
I mean, even worse than that. This was, I mean, it's hard to get worse than that. But another side point with that was, I mean, a lot of the mRNA testing with the vaccines was done on dead tissue from aborted fetuses in children. I mean, you can fact check me. I don't have the article in front of me, but I know that to be true. And the fact that a lot of people, I mean, that the Bill Burr analogy is exactly how I view it as well too. Like, it's hard for me to sit there and you can point a spot where it begins, like, oh, the heartbeat here. Oh, and it's just like, it's a process, dude. It was happening on like an atomical level. And just because you as a human being just can't see it, touch it, or feel it and smell it, doesn't mean that it's not alive. It's just one of those, like, if it's out of sight, out of mind type arguments. Well, like, I don't really think it's a baby. And it's kind of like, well, as long as I can convince myself that it's just like this organ thing that's inside of me, then it doesn't feel that bad. But then in reality, it's like the reason why, campuses ban, pastors from bringing on imagery is because it's showing like the harsh reality of like using pliers to pull apart pieces of a baby inside of somebody. Like, the process is entirely just so gross and disgusting. Like, I even have myself struggling to understand how doctors can do it. Like, I think that takes like a really kind of detached emotionality mindset to do that to another human being, let alone do it to another human being inside of another human being. It's just like, I can't never make those connections.
The truth is if something ends up in big business making a lot of money, they will make justifications, and people will believe those justifications. That's really it. Like, I think if more people knew the big business part of the abortion industry and how much money they're making off of stem cells from tissue, fetal tissue, placenta, things like that, I think people would find it to be a lot darker, because they're not doing it to take care of you or to make your life more convenient or to make sure that you don't end up in poverty. They're actually doing it because they make a lot of money from it, which is very much like the trans movement, right? Do you think people would be pushing that if somebody wasn't getting rich off it? No, people get rich off it. They pay protesters to push their movement and their idea, and that's how it gets to the mainstream, and everybody is okay with killing babies and chopping off kids' genitals, right? And that's just how it happens.
And all of a
Somebody
sudden
makes a lot of money. They pay people to boost their ideas of, we're chopping off genitals of children because it's good for them and not because it makes me very rich.
And it's just like, and it's like, even if it's like more so than just like understanding the profit model that's behind abortion, if people just understood like the profit model and like the incestuous nature of like hospitals, insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the way that stuff is all kind of tied together to ensure that it's a consistent, sufficient, profitized model, you probably wouldn't support universal healthcare until some of these things got changed. I mean, especially the way that, the way we're talking about it, like people will justify it because like they're getting paid in different avenues. Like I imagine most hospitals or insurances even offer like some level of like, well, if this hospital performs this many abortions in this term or this trimester, we'll give you like this many grants or this much grant money for this, or like we'll open these parameters here. And so they probably do incentivize it entirely financially to convince, these hospitals to take part of the program, to get their doctors involved in it. And it's, it's sad because it is like that whole, when you sell your soul to the devil, it's like, damn well what you're selling. It's just like you're searching for the shiniest straw in a pile of mud to justify it. And it's just all sad all around. And it brings me to this point too, because we had talked about, because we're less intelligent than, someone that's such like it's Jeff Younger, who was able to utilize the system. He ran in with the courts. He was like, I'm filing this motion, I'm going to do this, X, Y, and Z. It brings me to
in
this
our defense,
point.
that guy's probably more intelligent than most people.
Oh yeah, no, like probably the majority of anybody, because it brings me.
He's not setting the bar too low,
Right, exactly. Like this is somebody who would probably school, Ben Shapiro on a bad day, right? Like like it's a guy who could talk for miles. But it brings me to the point because we had talked about the Civil War aspect, and with this, what this mother's doing is essentially abandoning a state to go to a different state to get different protections, to do something that's entirely evil and illegal, for one. And well, legal, I guess, in California, but illegal in a different state. And it's going to cause, like, I mean, if this doesn't get put ahead on it, there will be violence, because when this happens, and probably will be, and probably already has happened to a man who has, less resources, less intellectual capital than a person such as Jeff Younger, they're probably going to do the lower IQ action, which would be something of aggressive or violent nature. And it brings me here to this string of tweets, which I'll go real quickly, because this is about the argument of abortion and people who are upset with Trump not taking an extremely hardened anti-abortion stance, which is Vince Dow in a response from Ryan Arcam TV, who I'm not familiar with, but he is somebody who is very vocal on the Christian aspect of conservative politics. Vince Dow takes a screenshot here of random user, whatever. He says, one step at a time, let's win a few elections. The culture will change with time. An unelectable position today may be an electable position in a few years. Incremental change is how the left has gained so much ground. Unfortunately, the right is limited by the same principle, in which Vince Dow says spot on. Ryan responds with this saying, oh, go ahead, my bad.
Oh, I was going to say that's basically what we were just saying too. I mean, it's simplified in a really easy to understand way, but I mean, the fact is you've got to win elections to make any change.
Yep.
And to win elections, you need to appeal to everybody, not just your base. Especially when you're going up against the kind of Leviathan that we all know is very skilled at stealing elections and not much else.
Fortifying.
So I mean, like, I know that there are a lot of people that want to say, it's the principle. You have to run on the principle, but sometimes you don't win on the principle, and then you don't get any change.
Right.
Whereas the incremental change at least is something, and it puts us on the right path.
Exactly. And this is where, and here you have someone who's hard disagreeing with both you and I and Vince Dow, saying, because we don't want to compromise on dismembering unborn babies, seems pretty straightforward. Because Vince Dow had said, I don't see why pro-lifers have such a hard time comprehending that this is simply how it works. And this is Ryan, who's taking the very hard, virtuous stance of like, because we're not going to compromise on dismembering unborn babies, seems pretty straightforward.
He's right though. No, I don't want to pretend like he's virtue signaling or anything. My guy Ryan is right. The world that we should live in should demand that our principles don't let us do that.
Correct.
But we don't live in that world. We live in the real world, and sometimes you have to be a realist to get shit done, right?
Yeah.
If we wanted to all be ideologues, we'd be just like the left, right? But we have to work within reality and what is practical. So I understand Ryan. I don't want to make fun of Ryan because he's right. This
Yeah.
isn't something I want to compromise on either, but I'd rather see some change on it than no change, which is the compromise that I'm willing to make. It isn't that I'm willing to say, well, okay, under some circumstances, it's okay to kill and rip up a baby. That's not what I want to say. But what I
Right.
do want to say is sometimes you get an option to make a little difference or no difference. And this is what I see here.
Mhm.
We're getting an option to make a little difference that maybe leads to a lot of difference later, or we get no change on that or any of the other issues that are bothering us on the right.
And in fact, it won't even be no change. It'll be regression. It'll be getting
Exactly,
further away
yeah.
from what we want to be doing.
And,
then-
and it won't just be regression on this one issue. It'll be regression on all of the problems, the
100%.
transing stuff, the economy. You know, he's not wrong. It's not something we should compromise on, but
Right.
some of us are realists and we understand that we have to play by the real world rules.
Yeah, no, and I wasn't saying that he's virtue signaling. I'm saying he's taking a stance on virtue. Or I guess a better word for that would be on principle.
My bad. My mistake.
No, you're good. Because the response is that as Vince Dow quotes this, saying this, which Vince is arguing that Ryan is virtue signaling, which is where I was going to disagree with Vince. Vince says, "Did you feel good saying that? Good. Now let me introduce you to reality." Because again, this is Vince being pragmatic versus Ryan being principled. Like this is the battle that's happening. And Vince says there's two options in the current system, and I quoted this because I disagreed. There are two options in the current system. One, incrementally change politics over time. Two, lose every election to abortion extremists and literally regress backwards, what we had just said. He says those are the only options that exist in the real world. That's the game currently. If you refuse to play the game or participate in the system, you'll never make progress. And then he adds, would you rather virtue signal or affect change? If you just want to tweet about abortion, fine, but don't pretend like it makes you morally superior to people trying to win the game. Which I thought, again, Vince was reading into it as if he was virtue signaling. Because again, maybe Vince doesn't know Ryan very that well. And maybe he just thought he was grabbing some random account. But I know Ryan is someone who's very, very stuck on principle. He's a very vocal Christian in this space.
Oh, I don't know Ryan at all either. So none of my opinion that I just stated was based on actually knowing the guy.
Yeah. And he's not big either. I think he's only got like 3,000 followers, but I do see him commonly referred to. This is what I said to it. I quoted Vince Dow and said, there's a third option that nobody wants to talk about and is honestly the highest measure of conviction within a principle. Are you willing to die for it?